This tiny seed was once worth more than gold, and 15,000 people were slaughtered to control it. There was once a spice worth more than gold. For a single handful of these small brown seeds, a man could buy a house in London and never work again. Kings craved it. Doctors swore it could stop the plague. But the price was never really paid in coins. To own the tree that grew it, a tree that lived on just a few islands smaller than most towns, an entire people was wiped from the face of the earth. 14,000 human beings. Gone. And today, that same spice sits in your kitchen cabinet, costing pennies. This is how it got soaked in blood. Pick it up and it disappoints you. A dull brown seed, wrinkled like a tiny walnut, hard as a pebble, no bigger than the tip of your thumb. It smells warm and sweet, like Christmas, like something baked. It looks like nothing. It looks like the cheapest thing in the world.
And for 400 years, men killed for it, sailed across oceans for it, and drowned in debt or blood chasing it. Hold that thought. Remember this little seed, because before this story ends, you will understand why one of these was once worth more than the life of the person who grew it. We are talking about nutmeg. Today you grate a whisper of it into eggnog or a pumpkin pie and think nothing of it. In the 17th century, that same whisper could bankrupt you, or make you a lord. In the markets of Europe, nutmeg sold for a markup so obscene that merchants spoke of it in hushed voices, the way people talk about lottery wins. A pound of it, carried from the far side of the world, could return its weight many hundreds of times over in gold. Sailors dreamed of smuggling just a few seeds home in their pockets. A single successful voyage could set a family up for generations. Why? Partly because Europe believed nutmeg was medicine. When the plague swept through cities and dropped bodies into the streets by the thousand, terrified doctors declared that nutmeg could ward it off. Wear a pouch of it around your neck. Grind it into your wine. The rich bought it in a panic, convinced that this little brown seed stood between them and a black, swollen death. They bought it out of fear of dying. They had no idea what dying it would cause. And here is the detail that turned nutmeg from a luxury into a weapon. It did not grow everywhere. It could not be farmed across continents like wheat or grapes. The nutmeg tree, for reasons of soil, of climate, of something almost magical in the volcanic earth, grew in only one place on the entire planet, a tiny scatter of islands in the middle of a distant sea, so small you could walk across some of them in an afternoon. Islands most Europeans could not have found on a map if their lives depended on it. Whoever controlled those few square miles of jungle controlled the entire world's supply of one of the most valuable substances in existence. Think about that. Not a mine, not a kingdom, a handful of specks of green land, ringed by coral, sitting in the shadow of a smoking volcano. Own them, and you owned a fortune that no army could match. Lose them, and you were nothing. So the most powerful trading empires on earth turned their eyes toward those islands. Fleets were built, guns were forged. Careful men in cold northern offices, men who had never smelled the sea air of the tropics, began to draw plans. To them, the people already living on those islands, people who had farmed the nutmeg trees for 1,000 years, who traded freely with anyone who sailed in, were not human beings with names and children and gods. They were an obstacle, a problem standing between the ledger and the profit. Before I take you to those islands, do one thing. If stories like this, the true, buried, uncomfortable ones, are what you came here for, subscribe now, because what happened next is one of the darkest bargains in human history, and almost no one has ever told you the whole of it. The people of those islands had a name. They had no idea that a word written in a European contract was already sharpening the knife. The paper was called a contract of monopoly. To the men who wrote it, it was a masterpiece of legal cunning, To the Bandanese, it was a death sentence they signed with their own hands, smiling, believing they were being generous hosts. Here is what it actually said. The elders of Banda would sell their nutmeg and mace to one buyer and one buyer only, the newly arrived company from the cold north. Not to the Javanese who had come for generations, not to the Arabs, the Chinese, the Malays, to no one else ever again. Every seed, every scrap of scarlet mace, every future harvest for all time was now promised to a single foreign power. And the price that buyer would pay was fixed, set laughably low, a fraction of what the spice was worth, and locked forever, regardless of what the rest of the world would gladly have paid. Why would any people agree to such a thing? The answer is that they did not understand they were agreeing to it. The elders who touched that paper came from a world of spoken promises and flexible deals, agreements that lasted a season, that could be renegotiated when circumstances changed, that bound the men in the room and no one else. The idea that a mark scratched on a page could chain their grandchildren to a stranger forever, could forbid them from ever selling to a friend again, could be enforced not by honor, but by cannon fire. This had no place in their thinking. There was no equivalent in their culture. They believed they were welcoming a strong new trading partner. They had, in fact, handed over the deed to their own destruction. And the company knew it. That was the horror of it. The men negotiating did not misunderstand the Bandanese. They understood them perfectly, and used that understanding as a weapon. They knew the elders could not read the document. They knew the concepts inside it did not translate. They pressed forward anyway, gifts in one hand, contract in the other, because a signature, however obtained, gave them something priceless. It gave them the right, in their own eyes and in the eyes of European law, to punish the Bandanese for breaking a promise the Bandanese never knew they had made. Because, of course, the islanders broke it. Almost immediately. When another ship sailed into the bay offering silver and rice for nutmeg, the Bandanese did what they had always done. They traded. Why would they not? A guest arrives, wants to buy, offers a fair price. To refuse would be madness, an insult, a rejection of everything their world was built on. So they sold. And in doing so, they became, on paper, in a language they could not read, in a court they would never see, criminals, traitors, contract breakers who had cheated the honest company that trusted them. The trap was perfect. First you make a people sign a promise they cannot comprehend, then you wait for them to break it, which they must, because keeping it would mean starving their own economy. And then, when they break it, you have your justification. Not greed, not conquest, justice. Punishment for the wicked natives who could not be trusted to honor their word. The company began building a fort, a low, thick-walled fortress of stone and cannon, squatting on the shore beneath the volcano, its guns pointed not out to sea at rival ships, but inward, at the villages, at the groves, at the people. The Bandanese watched it rise, stone by stone, and felt the first cold prick of understanding. This was not how a trading partner behaved. This was how a jailer behaved. Word traveled between the islands. In the council houses, the elders argued long into the night. Some counseled patience, more trade, more gifts to keep the strangers calm. Others said something the first group did not want to hear, that these men had not come to buy their spice. They had come to take their world. And that if the Bandanese did not drive them into the sea now, while there was still time, there would soon be no Banda left to save. They chose to resist. It was the bravest decision they ever made. It was also the one the company had been waiting for. They struck at dawn, and for one shining moment, it worked. The Bandanese knew their islands the way the strangers never could. Every hidden path through the nutmeg groves, every current in the bay, every place where a man could vanish into green shadow, and reappear behind his enemy. They had no cannon, no stone forts, no ships bristling with guns. What they had was surprise, numbers, and a rage born of watching their world be measured out and stolen. And when they finally moved against the company men who had grown too comfortable, too certain the natives would never dare, the islanders cut them down. One of the company's most senior officers, a man who had sailed in with orders and arrogance in equal measure, who had lectured the elders about their broken promises, was ambushed along with a group of his men. They were surrounded before they understood what was happening. The Bandanese killed dozens of them in a single stroke, the most important European deaths the islands had ever seen. For a moment, the fort's guns fell silent. The company reeled. Ships hesitated in the bay, and on the beaches beneath the smoking mountain, the Bandanese allowed themselves something they had not felt since the strangers first anchored: hope. They had done it. They had proven that these pale men bled and died like anyone else, that the islands could bite back, that Banda was not a prize to be simply picked up. Perhaps now the company would see the cost was too high. Perhaps now they would sail away and leave the Bandanese to their trees, their tides, their volcano, their 1,000-year-old way of life. In the council houses, some elders wept with relief. They believed the worst had passed. They were catastrophically wrong. They had not won a war. They had merely shown the company exactly what it had wanted to prove all along, that the Bandanese could not be controlled, only removed. And now, hold that seed I asked you to remember. The small, dull, wrinkled brown seed. Understand at last why every drop of this blood was being spilled over it. The nutmeg was not just valuable. It was uniquely, impossibly valuable in a way almost nothing else on earth could match. And the reason came down to a cruel accident of nature. The tree would only grow here. Botanists and merchants had tried for years to steal seedlings, to plant them elsewhere, to break Banda's grip, and failed. Again and again. The seeds rotted. The saplings died. Something in this specific soil, this specific rain, this specific shadow of this specific volcano could not be copied. So for as long as the world wanted nutmeg, and the world wanted it desperately, whoever held these few square miles held an absolute, unbreakable monopoly on a substance the entire planet craved. That is what made the math so monstrous. A normal resource has competition. If you demand too much, buyers go elsewhere. But there was no elsewhere. There was only Banda. And to a company obsessed with total control, an independent people sitting on the one source of infinite profit was not a partner to bargain with. It was an intolerable flaw in an otherwise perfect plan. The seed made the Bandanese rich. The seed also made them impossible to allow to live free. In owning the only nutmeg on earth, they had unknowingly painted a target on their own backs that could never be erased, not by treaty, not by trade, not by any concession they could offer. So the victory the Bandanese celebrated on those beaches was not a victory at all. It was the final proof the company needed to justify what it had perhaps intended from the very beginning. In the cold offices far away, and now in the fort beneath the volcano, a decision was hardening into place. If the Bandanese could not be trusted to obey, and could not be replaced as growers, then there was only one solution that guaranteed the nutmeg forever. Not to defeat them, to erase them. And the man who would carry out that erasure was already sailing toward the islands, with a fleet at his back, and a plan in his head so cold it would echo for 400 years. On the islands, it was an ordinary morning. Women spread the scarlet mace on woven mats to dry in the sun, turning it with practiced hands until it faded to a dull amber. Men climbed the tall trees with long poles, knocking down the ripe fruit that split to show its bright treasure. Children ran along the black sand, chasing each other into the surf. Smoke rose lazily from the volcano, as it always had, and the elders, who had wept with relief weeks before, now spoke, in the cool of the council houses, of the future. They believed they had bought it. They believed their courage had earned them peace, and that the strangers, having learned their lesson, would either trade fairly or leave. Life went on. It always had. Why would it not? But out beyond the horizon, past the curve of the sea where no one on the islands could see, the future was coming for them, and it did not care what they believed. The fleet was the largest the region had ever witnessed. Not a handful of trading ships this time, but a war armada. Vessels heavy with soldiers, with mercenaries hired from distant lands, with row upon row of cannon and the men trained to work them. This was not an expedition sent to negotiate, or even to punish in the ordinary sense. It had been assembled for a single purpose, planned coldly in advance, provisioned and armed for a task the men aboard understood perfectly, even if they did not say it aloud. They were not coming to win the islands. They were coming to empty them. At the head of it stood the man who had conceived it. He was clever, disciplined, utterly without mercy. An administrator who saw human beings as columns in a ledger and had decided, with the calm of a man balancing accounts, that the Banda problem could be solved permanently only one way. He had studied the earlier failures. He had watched the company try trade, try treaty, try intimidation, and watched the Bandanese slip free every time by simply doing what free people do. He had concluded that as long as a single independent Bandanese remained on those islands, the nutmeg could never be truly owned. So he would remove them, all of them, and in their place he would install something the company could control absolutely, a plantation, worked by people who had no rights, no history here, no ability to resist. He did not think of himself as a monster. That is the part that should chill you most. In his own mind, he was a problem solver, a loyal servant executing a rational strategy for the good of the company and the glory of his nation. The screams that were coming, the villages that would burn, the thousands who would die, these were, to him, simply the cost of a solution. Line items. The price of securing the only nutmeg on earth forever. And still, on the islands, the mace dried in the sun. Still the children played. Still the elders planned harvests they would never gather and trade deals they would never make. Somewhere, a mother sang to a baby who would not live to see the next full moon. Somewhere, an old man told a grandchild the names of the trees, believing that child would one day tell his own. None of them knew. The sea gave no warning. The volcano gave no sign. The single most important thing that would ever happen to their people was already decided, already sailing toward them, and they went about their mourning in perfect, terrible ignorance. Then the sails appeared on the horizon. At first, perhaps, it looked like good news. More ships meant more trade, more silver, more buyers for the harvest. Some may have walked down to the beaches to welcome them, as their grandparents had welcomed every ship for 1,000 years. It would have taken time for the shapes to resolve, for the count to become clear, for someone, standing on the black sand with the wind at his back, to understand that this was not a trading fleet at all, that there were too many ships, riding too low, bristling with too much iron. By the time the people of Banda understood what was truly arriving on their shores, the first boats were already lowering into the water, and it was already, absolutely, far too late to run. The boats came in through the surf, and the killing began before most of the islanders even understood there was a war. There was no battle in any honest sense of the word. A battle needs two armies. What happened on Banda was a machine meeting a people. Trained soldiers and hired mercenaries with steel and gunpowder against fishermen and farmers and the old men of the council, against women with mace still staining their hands amber, against children who had been chasing each other on that same black sand only hours before. The company's men moved through the villages methodically, the way you clear a field. They had not come for a fight. They had come to complete a task, and they worked at it. Some Bandanese fought. Of course they did. They snatched up whatever they could and threw themselves at armored men, and they died for it, and their courage changed nothing, because courage does not stop cannon. Others ran, into the groves they knew so well, up the slopes of the volcano, into caves, into the sea in whatever boats they could reach. Families scattered into the green trying to hide. The soldiers followed. There was nowhere on those small islands far enough to run, and the men hunting them were patient. The elders, the same men who had touched a paper they could not read, who had wept with relief believing peace was won, who had spent their lives settling disputes with words and consensus, were rounded up. Dozens of them, the leaders of a civilization, the living memory of the islands, the men who knew the names of the trees and the meaning of the tides. They were executed, not in the heat of fighting, but afterward, deliberately, as a statement. A people without its elders is a people without its past, and that was precisely the point. Cut off the memory, and the rest withers. Do you remember the old man from before, the one telling his grandchild the names of the trees, believing the child would one day tell his own? Multiply him by thousands. Every grandfather, every mother who sang, every child in the surf. That is the shape of what was erased here. Not soldiers, a world. An entire way of being human, thousands of years in the making, unraveled in a matter of weeks by men following orders and balancing accounts. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in the mind. Before the fleet came, perhaps 15,000 people lived on these islands. When it was over, fewer than 1,000 remained. Some had escaped by sea to other islands, carrying nothing but their lives and the memory of everything lost. The rest were dead, or dragged away in chains to be sold, their labor now belonging to the company like everything else. A whole people, reduced to a rounding error, a line item that had finally been resolved. And then came the silence. This is the part the numbers cannot capture, and the part that should stay with you. The villages stood empty. The mats of mace lay abandoned, drying in a sun that no longer shone on anyone who cared. The tall trees still bore their fruit, split open and unpicked, the scarlet mace rotting on the branch because there was no one left who knew how or why to gather it. Smoke still rose from the volcano, over a landscape of homes with no families in them, of council houses with no elders, of a beach where no children ran. The islands were exactly as beautiful as they had always been. They were simply, now, almost entirely empty of the people who had made them a home. The man who had planned it looked out over his achievement and, by his own reckoning, saw success. The Banda problem was solved. The nutmeg was secured. The company could now do what it had wanted from the very first ship. Own the only source on Earth, absolutely, forever, answerable to no one. He had won, and to make certain the victory could never be undone, he had one thing left to do. Replace the people he had erased with a system so total, so ruthless, that Banda would never belong to itself again. What replaced the Bandanese was not a society. It was a machine for making money out of dirt. The company carved the emptied islands into neat parcels and handed them to its own men, loyal servants rewarded with land soaked in the blood of the people who had tended it for 1,000 years. These new masters did not know how to grow nutmeg, and they did not need to. They would not touch it themselves. The work would be done by others, enslaved people shipped in from across the region, torn from their own homes and their own families, given no wage, no rights, no future, and set to labor in the very groves where a free people had lived and sung and died. The nutmeg still ripened, the mace still dried in the sun, but now every seed passed straight into the ledgers of a corporation at a price it alone decided, protected by cannon that never again pointed anywhere but at the workers. For nearly 2 centuries the monopoly held. The company controlled the world's supply of a single spice so completely that it could burn warehouses full of nutmeg to keep prices high, while people elsewhere paid fortunes for a pinch. It made staggering wealth from those small volcanic islands, wealth that helped build a golden age far away, that raised grand houses and canals and paintings we still admire today, financed entirely, in part, by a genocide most of the people admiring them have never heard of. And here is the turn that should stop you cold. For years, the company's great rival was another northern power that held a single, stubborn island in the Banda Group. One small piece of ground the company could not pry loose, a thorn in an otherwise total monopoly. The two nations fought over it, negotiated over it, and finally, in a treaty far away, they made a trade. The rival power agreed to give up its claim to that last little nutmeg island. In exchange, it received, permanently, a different island the company held on the far side of the world. A cold, muddy, unpromising place that nobody at the time thought was worth much at all. That island was Manhattan. Read that again. The reason New York City is not named after a Dutch fort today, the reason the modern world map looks the way it does, traces back to a bargain in which a scrap of the Banda Islands, that black sand, those groves, that erased people, was judged so precious that an entire future metropolis was handed over to get it. The blood spilled beneath that volcano is woven invisibly into the story of one of the most famous cities on Earth. Empires rose and rearranged the whole planet over a seed you could hold between two fingers. And the people who paid for all of it? For a long time, the world simply forgot them. The company eventually collapsed under its own corruption and debt, as such things do. The monopoly finally broke when the trees were at last smuggled out and grown elsewhere, and nutmeg became ordinary, cheap, a jar in every kitchen. The very thing thousands had died to keep rare. Today, you can buy for pocket change the spice that once bought and sold human lives by the thousand. The islands are quiet. The volcano still smokes, and most people who sprinkle nutmeg into their food have no idea that they are touching the end of one of the coldest, most complete acts of corporate murder in human history. That is why this story matters, and why it should never be allowed to fade again. Because it was not madness or chaos that erased the Bandanese. It was a plan. A rational, profitable, carefully executed plan, carried out by ordinary men who slept soundly and balanced their books. The most terrifying evil in history has rarely worn the face of a monster. It has worn the face of a businessman doing his job. If this story moved you, if you did not know it before today, then help make sure it is not forgotten. Subscribe and stay with me. Because history is full of these silences, these erased worlds hidden behind the everyday objects we never question. And one by one, we are going to bring them back into the light.